October 6, 2024. Blackwood, Massachusetts. The fog came in from the Atlantic like a living thing rolling over the coastal cliffs, swallowing the narrow road ahead. Eleanor Graves kept her rental car steady at 30, the tires humming against cracked asphalt. Her GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, and the last gas station she'd passed looked like it had been shuttered since the 80s. Out here, there were no streetlights, no signs, no passing headlights, just her, the ocean somewhere to her left, and the endless woods to her right. She was used to driving into the unknown. As an investigative journalist, she had covered war-torn villages, backwater cults, and unsolved murder sites. But there was something different about this stretch of road, a kind of watchfulness in the dark. Blackwood. The name had first come to her in a half-forgotten newspaper clipping from 1924. Buried in an archive in Boston, the headline was blunt: Heiress Margaret Blackwood disappears. Family estate abandoned. No body had been found. No suspects named. The mansion, already notorious for a century of strange tragedies, was sealed by court order. But next week marked exactly 100 years since Margaret's disappearance, and Eleanor had convinced the New England Ledger to let her do a feature on the estate. She hadn't told them she planned to spend the night inside. Her first glimpse of the town came as the fog thinned briefly, a cluster of dim lights along a single main street, the faint outline of a clock tower at its center. She parked in front of the Blackwood Diner, a squat brick building with a hand-painted sign and the smell of strong coffee drifting from inside. A bell jingled when she stepped in. The place was half full, a few fishermen in weather-beaten jackets, a young couple with steaming bowls of chowder, and a waitress in her 50s with a stiff blonde beehive. The conversations dimmed the moment Eleanor crossed the threshold. It wasn't subtle. She smiled politely, chose a booth by the window, and opened her notebook. The waitress appeared a moment later with a menu she didn't look at. Passing through? The woman asked, pen poised. Actually, I'm here on an assignment, Eleanor said. I'm writing about the Blackwood estate. The pen stopped. A flicker something between irritation and unease passed over the waitress's face. You don't want to go up there, she said. It wasn't advice, it was a statement. I've heard the stories, Eleanor replied lightly. But that's why I'm here. The waitress pressed her lips into a thin line. People who go poking around that place don't always come back. From the counter, one of the fishermen let out a derisive laugh, but it sounded strained. She learned quick enough, he muttered. Eleanor set down her pen. What happened to Margaret Blackwood? The waitress shifted her weight. Some say she ran off with a lover. Some say her family was cursed. But my grandfather, he was a boy, then swore he saw her in the window of the West Wing, days after they said she was gone. And then, Eleanor asked. The waitress's voice dropped to a whisper. And then the lights in that wing went out, for good. A heavy silence followed. The fisherman avoided her eyes. Eleanor sipped her coffee and let the weight of the moment sink in. By late afternoon, she had the directions she needed, 2 miles north out of town, then left onto Blackwood Road, a cracked and overgrown lane that wound uphill into the trees. The first sight of the mansion hit her harder than she expected. Blackwood Manor loomed at the crest of a hill, its stone walls streaked black with rain, its peaked roof sagging in places. Dozens of windows stared blankly down, many boarded over, others gaping like missing teeth. Even from the drive, Eleanor could see the massive double doors oak, weathered, and carved with some intricate pattern too far away to make out. She parked by the rusted gates, which hung crooked on their hinges. The air was colder here, and the wind carried the faint tang of the ocean mixed with something metallic like rust or blood. She pushed the gates open and started up the path. The weeds were waist-high, and the gravel crunched loudly under her boots. The front doors resisted at first, then groaned open into a cavernous entry hall. Dust motes drifted in slanted beams of light from the grimy windows. A grand staircase swept upward in a slow curve, its banister draped with cobwebs. The chandelier overhead was huge, crystal darkened with grime, swaying ever so slightly, though there was no breeze. To her left, a set of double doors led into what had once been a parlor, velvet chairs sagging with age, a cold fireplace yawning in the wall. To her right, a dining hall stretched long and narrow, its table still set for a dinner that would never come. It felt less like an abandoned house and more like a stage set, waiting for actors to return. She set her bag down in the parlor and began unpacking: camera, voice recorder, flashlight, batteries, thermos of coffee. She planned to walk the perimeter before nightfall, but something caught her eye, an object on the mantel above the fireplace. It was a silver hand mirror, its glass cracked in a perfect spiral. When she picked it up, The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Her reflection wavered, not from the crack, but as if the surface were water, rippling. And then, just for an instant, she saw someone behind her in the mirror, a woman in a 1920s gown, face pale, eyes dark as ink. Eleanor spun around. The room was empty. She spent the next hour photographing every corner of the ground floor. Several of the doors were locked, including one at the end of the west hall. The brass handle was ice cold to the touch. By the time she finished, the last light of day was dying, and the fog had begun to creep up the hill. She made camp in the parlor, unrolling her sleeping bag near the cold fireplace. She had just settled in when she heard it soft, distant, and unmistakable. A gramophone. The melody was old-fashioned, waltz-like, drifting from somewhere above. Eleanor grabbed her flashlight and followed the sound up the staircase. The second floor was darker, the air thick with the scent of mildew. The music grew louder as she neared the west wing, the sealed section the waitress had mentioned. It stopped the moment she touched the locked door. In the silence that followed, she thought she heard something else, very faint, coming from behind the door. A woman's voice, whispering her name. The whisper lingered in Eleanor's ears long after she'd backed away from the locked door. She knew what she had heard, her name, not spoken, but breathed, as if the voice had formed right inside her skull. She stood in the dark hall, her flashlight beam trembling across the faded wallpaper. The gramophone was silent now. The air was still. But her heart kept racing, urging her to turn back. She did slowly, one step at a time, retreating to the grand staircase. The floorboards under her boots groaned louder than before, as though the sound carried further than it should in a space this size. By the time she reached the parlor, night had fallen. The fog had thickened outside, pressing against the windows like damp cotton. The glass reflected only her dim lantern light and the shadowy outline of the room. She poured herself coffee from the thermos, sat in one of the velvet chairs, and began recording her notes aloud. Entry hall, parlor, dining room, all intact but heavily decayed. Multiple locked doors, including West Hall on the second floor. Audio anomaly, music. Possible environmental cause whined through damaged windows or debris interacting with structure. She stopped. The chair across from her creaked. Her eyes darted to it. The upholstery sagged, untouched, no movement. She turned her recorder back on. Possible settling of structure. Old wood. Could explain. The creak came again. Longer. Slower. Like someone leaning back in the chair. Eleanor set the recorder down. Who's there? She called out, hating the tremor in her voice. The room answered with silence. Then from upstairs, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. She rose, flashlight in hand, and moved toward the staircase. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself resisted her climb. At the landing, she paused. The knocks came again, this time closer. Not from the sealed west wing, but from a door just to her left. She reached for the handle. It turned easily. The door swung open to reveal a bedroom dust-coated furniture. A 4-poster bed draped in a moth-eaten canopy. The remains of a vanity table with its mirror shattered into jagged shards. She stepped inside, scanning with her light, and froze. The shards in the mirror were reflecting not just the room, but movement. Something passing quickly behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her breath came faster now. She took one photo, the flash bursting like lightning. The camera's display flickered. For a split second, she swore she saw a woman standing in the corner, head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes black. Then the image was gone. Eleanor didn't sleep much after that. She curled in her sleeping bag in the parlor, flashlight within reach, her camera set to record video through the night. The house was never silent. Even in the deepest hours, she could hear faint movements, floorboards groaning, doors settling in their frames, something soft brushing against the walls. At 2:14 a.m., she woke to the sound of breathing. Not her own. It was above her, directly overhead, as though someone stood in the room upstairs, leaning down through the floorboards. Slow, steady, human. She held her breath and listened. The sound stayed for nearly a full minute before fading into the distance. When she finally dared to move, she grabbed her camera and checked the footage. The red recording light was still on, but the display was black. Every file from the past hour had been corrupted. Morning came gray and damp. Eleanor woke to the smell of salt air and something else rot. She followed it through the dining hall to a narrow service door at the back. It opened into a servant's corridor, the walls lined with peeling plaster. At the far end, a steep stairway descended into darkness. Basement. She hesitated. In every haunted house story she'd ever researched, the basement was where the worst things hid. But this was her job. The air grew colder with each step. Her flashlight beam caught on rusted pipes, cobwebs thick as drapes, and, at the far end, a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. It was closed, but not locked. Her fingers brushed the latch. Something moved behind the door. She froze. A shuffle, a slow, dragging sound. Then 3 soft taps from the other side. The exact same rhythm as the knocks from upstairs. Eleanor's skin crawled. She backed away slowly, heart hammering, until she was back at the stairs. She didn't run, but it was close. By the time she returned to the parlor, the fog outside had lifted just enough to see the grounds. The front gates stood open. She was sure, absolutely sure, she had closed them the night before. Something or someone had come in. The open gates gnawed at Eleanor's thoughts all morning. She tried to dismiss it. Maybe the wind had shifted them. Maybe the hinges were so corroded they swung free on their own. But the image of them standing wide in the fog stayed with her. She had come here for answers, and hiding in the parlor wasn't going to find them. By noon, she was back upstairs, standing before the locked door of the west wing. She studied the lock. Brass, old but sturdy, the kind you couldn't simply pick with a paperclip. Her eyes drifted to a nearby linen closet. Inside, she found a rusted fire axe. The sound of the first swing echoed down the hall like a gunshot. The wood splintered under the blade. 3 more blows, and the door gave way, sagging inward on its hinges. A rush of stale air poured out, colder than the rest of the house. Eleanor stepped inside. The west wing was preserved. The hallway carpets, though dusty, still held their rich crimson color. The wallpaper here wasn't peeling. The light from the windows was muted but steady. It was as if this part of the house had been frozen in time, untouched for the last 100 years. She passed closed doors, each marked with small brass plaques: library, study, music room. The gramophone melody she'd heard the first night floated back into her mind. At the end of the hall, a double door stood half open. She pushed it wider and stepped into a drawing room. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Not dust, not mildew, but faint perfume, sweet and floral. A faint draft stirred the lace curtains. In the center of the room stood a grand piano, its keys yellowed with age. On top of it lay sheet music, open to a waltz titled Midnight Reverie. She reached for it, and a note played, a single, clear piano note. Her hand froze inches from the keys. Another note followed, then another. The melody formed, slow and hesitant, as if played by unseen fingers. Eleanor backed away until her shoulders touched the wall. The music kept going, gaining confidence, until it matched a waltz on the sheet. And then abruptly it stopped. In the silence, she realized the perfume was stronger now. She turned toward the window. A woman stood there, the same one from the mirror. Pale skin, black eyes, 1920s gown shimmering faintly in the muted light. Eleanor's throat tightened. "Margaret Blackwood?" she whispered. The woman's lips curved into the faintest smile. And then she was gone. The rest of the wing was no kinder. In the library, dust lay on the bookshelves in perfect undisturbed layers, except for one book on a reading table, open to a page marked in ink. The walls remember the voices. The study's desk drawers were locked, but one had been forced open at some point, its contents scattered ledgers. A cracked photograph of Margaret, standing with 3 other people Eleanor didn't recognize. Their eyes were scratched out. The music room held only silence now. She was about to leave when she noticed a small door behind the piano. Narrow, hidden almost completely in the paneling. She crouched to open it. The hinges squealed. A short flight of steps led down into darkness. She flicked on her flashlight and descended. The space was cramped, more like a crawl space than a room. The walls were lined with shelves holding boxes, all unmarked. She opened the nearest one. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Each showed a different person, men, women, children, standing in front of the mansion. Most of the images were faded. But in everyone, the subject's eyes were the same unnatural shade of black. Some of the faces were recent. One photo dated just last year showed the waitress from the diner. Eleanor's hands trembled as she replaced the box. She didn't hear the sound until she straightened, the faint click of the crawlspace door swinging shut. Her flashlight beam caught movement in the corner. Something hunched, shifting its weight. She took a step back, heart pounding. "Hello?" The shape moved forward, just enough for the light to catch its face. It wasn't human. The skin was stretched too tight, the mouth too wide, and the eyes, those black eyes, shone like wet stone. It took a single step toward her. Eleanor bolted. She shoved the door open and scrambled back into the music room, slamming it behind her. For a moment, she thought she heard something on the other side, a low, wet laugh. When she finally emerged from the west wing, the rest of the house felt different. The shadows were deeper, the air heavier. It no longer felt like she was visiting the mansion. It felt like the mansion was visiting her. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Elena avoided the west wing entirely, retreating to the dining hall with her notes and camera. She played back her recordings from the sealed rooms, but the files were filled with bursts of static so loud it nearly drowned out the faint, rhythmic knocking that appeared again and again. By sunset, the light filtering through the mansion's tall windows had turned amber, then bruised purple. She decided to explore one last area before nightfall, the long gallery that ran along the second floor as east side. The gallery's walls were lined with portraits, dozens of them, stretching from the 1800s to the early 1920s. Men in stiff suits, women in lace and silk, children in solemn Sunday best, all Blackwoods, she assumed. The family resemblance was unmistakable: sharp cheekbones, narrow jaws, eyes that seemed a little too dark even in oil paint. The frames were thick with dust, but the faces inside seemed untouched by time. She paused in front of a large portrait near the center. Margaret Blackwood. The artist had painted her in a cream-colored gown, seated in the drawing room Eleanor had seen earlier. Her lips were faintly smiling, her gaze locked on the viewer. Something about her eyes bothered Eleanor. Not their darkness exactly, but their focus too sharp, too aware. She took a step back. Margaret's head had turned, just slightly, enough that she was no longer looking straight ahead, but directly at Eleanor. Eleanor blinked hard, looked again. Margaret's head was in its original position. She moved further down the gallery, scanning the other paintings. That's when she noticed the change. The expressions were shifting. A young boy who had been smiling in the first pass now had his mouth turned down, eyes wide with some unspoken fear. An elderly man's neutral gaze had become an unmistakable glare. It wasn't every portrait, just a handful. But they were all watching her now. She turned back toward the entrance and froze. The nearest portrait, a woman in a high-necked gown, now bore Eleanor's face. The likeness was perfect, down to the loose strand of hair that had fallen across her forehead. Her stomach dropped. She stumbled backward, heart pounding, until her shoulder struck the opposite wall. The impact jolted something loose behind her, an almost imperceptible click. A hidden door. It swung open into a narrow stairwell spiraling downward into darkness. The air that rose from it was damp, metallic. Against her better judgment, Eleanor descended. The stairs ended in a stone chamber lit only by her flashlight. The walls here were raw rock, as if carved directly from the earth beneath the mansion. In the center stood a stone pedestal. On it, a framed photograph, its glass cracked, showed Margaret standing beside the mansion gates. Her smile was wide. And standing just behind her, blurred, indistinct, was someone Eleanor recognized instantly. Herself. The same hair, same jacket, same camera slung over her shoulder. She staggered back, almost tripping on the uneven floor. The sound came then low and deliberate. A whisper. "You've always been here." The flashlight flickered. Something moved in the darkness beyond its reach, shapes too tall, too thin to be human. They swayed slightly, as if in a wind that didn't touch her. One of them took a step forward. The beam caught its face. It was Margaret. But her mouth was wrong, too wide, too sharp, and her eyes were black pits that swallowed the light. Eleanor bolted up the stairs, the whisper following her all the way. "Stay." She slammed the hidden door shut and backed away into the gallery. The portraits were different now. Every single one bore her face. Eleanor didn't sleep. The faces in the portraits haunted her mind, each one her own, staring out with the same cold stillness as the Blackwoods. She sat in the parlor until the darkness outside began to lighten, then stood and walked toward the servants' corridor. She didn't want to go down there. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run while she still could. But the basement had been calling her since the first night, softly, persistently, like the tide pulling at the shore. The air grew colder with every step down the narrow staircase. Her flashlight's beam carved out damp stone walls, rusted pipes dripping condensation. At the far end waited the heavy iron-banded door. It was already open. A narrow passage stretched beyond, lit faintly by some unseen source. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and iron. Eleanor stepped inside. The sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere ahead, rhythmic and steady. The tunnel widened into a circular chamber. In the center, a stone well rose from the floor, its rim slick with moisture. The water inside was dark, too dark, its surface faintly reflecting the dim light from above. She stepped closer, peering into the blackness. The smell was stronger here, unmistakable now, blood. The stone around the well's base was stained a deep, rusty red. Something shifted in the water, a ripple, then another. Her breath caught as a pale shape rose slowly from the depths of face. It wasn't Margaret's, it wasn't anyone she recognized. But the eyes, they were black, bottomless. The face sank again without a sound, leaving only ripples that spread across the surface before fading back to stillness. On the far wall, carved deep into the stone, were words. Every century, one bloodline, one life. She traced the letters with her fingertips. The grooves were old, worn smooth in places. Footsteps echoed behind her. She spun around, but the tunnel was empty. The sound came again closer this time. Wet, deliberate. Her flashlight flickered. Figures emerged from the shadows along the chamber's edge. Tall, thin shapes, their skin stretched pale over bone. Their faces were smooth where eyes and mouths should have been. But she could hear them. The year has come. One stepped forward, its head tilting in an almost curious way. The house remembers. A sudden image flashed in her mind, Margaret standing at this very well, surrounded by these same faceless figures. Her hands were bound, her face pale but calm. She leaned over the rim as if offering herself willingly. The water took her without a splash. The vision faded. The figures moved closer. Eleanor backed toward the tunnel, heart pounding. "You are the blood," they whispered together, their voices weaving into a sound like wind through dead leaves. She turned and ran, the light bouncing wildly across the walls. She didn't stop until she slammed the basement door shut behind her and braced it with the fire axe. Only then did she realize her hands were wet. The smell told her it wasn't water. By evening, the house was louder. Doors creaked open on their own. Floorboards groaned under invisible weight, and faint music drifted from nowhere. She knew she couldn't leave now, not because she didn't want to, but because the gates would not be open for her. The mansion was keeping her. October 13th, 7 days until the centennial. Eleanor marked the date in her notebook, though she didn't need to. The number had been whispering itself in her head since the moment she woke. 7 days, over and over. She tried the gates again that morning. They wouldn't move, not even an inch. She leaned her full weight against them, but it felt like pushing on a wall of stone. When she turned back toward the mansion, she could swear the windows were different. More of them seemed unboarded now, dark panes watching her from every floor. She spent the morning combing through the library, searching for anything that might explain the bloodline carving at the well. Most of the ledgers were mundane farm accounts, shipping manifests, correspondence between the Blackwoods and other wealthy families along the coast. But in the bottom drawer of the desk, she found a small black ledger marked only with a date, 1824. The handwriting inside was elegant, precise. October 13th, the house awoke again, chose another. I told her the truth, and she went to the water willingly. The entries repeated every 100 pages, always October 13th, always a name written beside the date. 1824. 1924. The last name in the book stopped there, Margaret. There was no space left. The next page was blank. Eleanor's stomach turned as she realized what that meant. The next name would be hers. That night, the house changed. She was writing notes in the parlor when the gramophone began to play again, soft, lilting, a melody she now knew by heart. Midnight Reverie. It came from upstairs, from the West Wing. She told herself she wouldn't go. Then the music stopped, replaced by a voice. Her mother's voice. "Ellie?" Her throat tightened. "Mom?" She whispered, even though she knew her mother was 2,000 miles away in Arizona. The voice came again, closer. "Ellie, please, I'm upstairs. I can't get out." Eleanor grabbed her flashlight and mounted the stairs before she could think better of it. The West Wing was colder than she remembered. Frost edged the corners of the window panes. The voice led her to the music room. The piano was uncovered now, its keys gleaming as though freshly polished. The sheet music was gone. "Ellie." It came from the crawlspace door. Her hand hovered over the latch, heart hammering. She pulled it open. The space was pitch black. She aimed her flashlight inside, and the beam caught a face inches from hers. It was her mother, but the eyes were wrong. Black, endless, the mouth stretched too wide, smiling in a way her mother never had. The thing lunged, and Eleanor slammed the door shut, stumbling back into the piano. The lid crashed down on the keys, the discordant noise echoing through the wing. The rest of the night was worse. Something paced the halls outside the parlor. The sound was deliberate, heavy, circling the room again and again. At one point, The pacing stopped directly outside her door, and she heard breathing slow, steady, inhumanly deep. She didn't sleep. Morning brought no relief. In the kitchen, she found footprints in the dust bare feet, larger than any humans, leading from the back door toward the basement stairs. On the dining table, the silver hand mirror she'd found on her first night lay waiting. The crack in its glass had widened. When she looked into it, she didn't see herself at all. She saw the well, and something climbing out of it. The storm outside had turned feral. The wind screamed against the shutters, rain lashed the cracked glass, and lightning illuminated the hallway in jagged white flashes. Eleanor stumbled toward the stairs, clutching the railing, her chest heaving. She didn't remember coming here. She didn't remember moving at all. Her thoughts were no longer her own. The shadows on the walls moved differently now. They no longer waited for her to pass before shifting. They seemed to reach for her. Long, crooked fingers of darkness stretched from the corners, brushing her clothes and hair like they were feeling her texture. She heard her own voice whispering, but her lips weren't moving. Her pulse thundered. She turned toward the parlor, but the corridor seemed longer than before, the floorboards warping under her feet. Her head swam. She felt light, almost disconnected from her body, as if she were a marionette being steered by invisible strings. When she finally reached the parlor, the fireplace was already lit. The same armchair she had sat in her first night faced the flames. The gramophone in the corner spun slowly, though the record was broken in half. Yet a song, a low, mournful violin, poured from it. Her legs carried her to the chair without her permission. She sat. The air shifted. It wasn't cold anymore. It was thick, almost wet. The scent of lilac and rot mingled in her nose. From the firelight, a figure emerged, Margaret Blackwood. In her black morning gown, the veil pulled back. Her face was pale, lips bluish, eyes sunken, but her expression was warm. Too warm. Margaret knelt beside Eleanor's chair, placing icy fingers on her cheek. Eleanor's vision flickered. She saw herself in the mirror above the mantel, but not as she was. Her reflection wore Margaret's dress. Her hair was pinned in an old-fashioned style, and her eyes, they were no longer hers. The shadows closed in from every corner of the room, creeping toward her feet like an incoming tide. The violin music grew louder, joined by a low, rhythmic thud, like a heartbeat coming from the walls. Margaret leaned closer. Eleanor tried to scream, but her voice was gone. Her chest ached as something cold seeped into her bones. The firelight dimmed until the room was nearly black, save for the gleam of Margaret's teeth. Her body began to rise from the chair without her will. The house was no longer a place she stood inside, it was inside her. Somewhere deep in her mind, the real Eleanor pounded against invisible glass, her thoughts muffled under a rising tide of whispers. The last thing she heard before everything went dark was Margaret's voice in her head. Eleanor woke to silence. Not the natural kind. No rustle of leaves, no drip of rain, no groan of settling wood. This silence was heavy, almost physical, pressing against her eardrums. She was standing in the mansion's grand hall, though she had no memory of walking there. The chandelier above her swayed gently, though there was no wind. Its crystals were not clear anymore. They were filled with a slow-moving black liquid that pulsed faintly, like veins. Her clothes were different. Gone were her jeans and sweater. Now she wore a floor-length black gown with lace cuffs, the same style she had seen in the faded portraits. Her hands were pale, almost translucent, and when she lifted them, her veins glowed faintly under the skin. The double doors to the ballroom creaked open on their own. Candlelight flickered within, dozens of flames dancing without smoke. The floor shone like polished obsidian, and on it, shapes began to appear. At first, they looked like shadows, tall, thin figures in Victorian clothing. But as they turned toward her, Eleanor realized their faces were missing. Where eyes should be were pits of swirling darkness. A voice echoed, though it didn't come from any one direction. Margaret Blackwood stepped forward from among them. Her veil was gone now, revealing a smile that was all wrong, too wide, too knowing. The floor beneath Eleanor's feet rippled like water. When she looked down, she saw scenes playing out within the blackness, moments from her own life, her childhood bedroom, her college graduation, the cafe she had worked at last year. All of them were fading at the edges, dissolving into darkness. She felt her memories slipping. Her name became harder to recall. Her parents' faces blurred. Her own voice sounded foreign. The faceless guests began to dance, a slow, haunting waltz in complete silence. Margaret took Eleanor's hand, guiding her to the center of the floor. The moment their palms touched, Eleanor felt the mansion inside her mind, whispering in languages she didn't know, showing her flashes of people she'd never met, all wearing this same black gown. Margaret whispered into her ear. Lightning struck somewhere far above. The chandelier stopped swaying. Every candle went out at once. In the sudden darkness, Eleanor saw hundreds of faintly glowing eyes all around her, not from the faceless guests, but from the walls themselves. The house had accepted her, and she knew, deep in her stolen bones, that the front door would never open for her again. The eyes didn't blink, they didn't move. They only shimmered faintly, like coals in a dying fire, each one fixed on Eleanor with the stillness of things that had been waiting far too long. Her breath came shallow, ragged. Every inhalation carried the scent of the house, damp stone, rotting wood, and something faintly metallic, like a blade left too long in the rain. She turned slowly, knowing that if she made any sudden movement, the watchers might react. The faint light from the sconces, now pale and sickly, illuminated what she had mistaken for carved patterns in the walls. They weren't patterns. They were faces, pressing outward from the plaster, straining against the paint. Their features were distorted as though they'd been submerged in wax and left to melt. Mouths were open in silent screams, their lips warped, their cheeks sunken. And every single pair of those glowing eyes followed her. From somewhere deep in the manor, a grandfather clock told. Not the hour, no, it was too slow, too deliberate, each chime dragging on until it became a groan of metal on metal. Eleanor counted 7, 8, 9. But it didn't stop at 12. It went on 13, 14. By the 17th chime, she realized her knees were trembling. Her hands itched to cover her ears, but something in her gut screamed not to move, because the faces in the wall were smiling now. "The dining room is ready, Miss Graves." The voice came from directly behind her, low, refined, completely calm, the voice of a man who had rehearsed etiquette for centuries. She turned. A tall figure stood in the hallway, not a shadow, not a ghostly blur, but solid. His suit was perfectly tailored, though the fabric seemed a century out of fashion. His skin was so pale, it almost matched the moonlight filtering through the cracked windows. But it was his eyes, black, reflective, like polished obsidian, that rooted her to the spot. He gave a slight bow. "We so rarely have new guests, and the household has been longing to feed." He led her without touching, his presence pulling her forward like a tether. The corridor seemed longer than before. Doors multiplied along the walls, each ajar just enough for her to glimpse movements inside. Long hair dragging across the floor, fingers curling around doorframes, a child's laugh, muffled and wrong. The dining room doors loomed ahead, carved with seams she didn't dare study too closely. The man placed one pale hand on the handle. When he opened it, the smell hit her first. Not food, not wine. Something wet, fresh, and coppery. The banquet table stretched farther than the length of the room should have allowed. Candles burned with blue flames, casting the guests in a spectral glow. They were dressed in ballroom finery from a dozen eras, velvet, lace, silk, yet none of them had faces. Only the faintly glowing eyes floating above the collars of their clothes. They didn't move until Eleanor was pushed, without a touch, toward the head of the table. A chair scraped back on its own. The tall man gestured to it. "Please, you are our honored course." Her knees nearly buckled. "Course?" He smiled faintly. "Forgive me, guest, for now." As she sat, the faceless diners tilted their heads toward her. Silver platters were placed in front of them by servants who looked more like shadows than people. The lids lifted, and the smell hit harder, raw meat, dark and glistening. Except it wasn't meat, it was parts. Human fingers arranged like hors d'oeuvres, eyes floating in dark broth. A heart, still beating, nestled in a silver bowl. Eleanor's stomach twisted, bile burning her throat. She tried to stand, but the chair held her in place, unseen hands gripping her shoulders. The tall man raised a glass of thick black liquid, to the 100th year. May the house remain full. The guests raised their glasses in unison. From the walls, the faces began to chant. Not words, not in any language she knew, but a sound that was low, guttural, and hungry. The walls themselves seemed to lean closer. Somewhere above, something massive shifted, beams groaning, floors creaking, as if the mansion was breathing. The tall man leaned down, close enough for her to feel the cold in his voice. "Miss Graves," he said softly, "you belong to us now. But you may yet earn your place." "How?" she forced out, her voice trembling. The smile returned, slow and deliberate. By feeding the house, just as it has fed you. The silence was different now. Not the hush of a paused breath, nor the reverence of a church, but the slow, deliberate quiet of something listening. Eleanor stood in the grand ballroom, her breath shallow, the faint green glow of the walls casting shadows that writhed like restless ghosts. The glowing eyes embedded in the plaster blinked in perfect unison. Each blink made the walls closer. She couldn't explain it, but with every blink, the walls crept a few inches inward, as if the house was leaning in to hear her thoughts. She wanted to scream, but even her voice seemed stolen. From somewhere in the blackness above, a soft, scraping sound began. Not footsteps, not claws. Something dragging across the ceiling. She tilted her head up slowly, and saw them. Figures, dozens of them, crawling upside down like pale spiders. Their necks craned downward, jaws opening wide enough to split their skin. Tongues, impossibly long, brushed the air, tasting for her. "Why me?" she whispered. The walls answered. The eyes flared, and a deep, resonant voice filled her head. Not spoken aloud, but inside her skull. "Because you entered uninvited, yet stayed willingly." She wanted to deny it, but the truth struck deep. She had stayed. She could have left when the whispers first began, when the doors still might have opened. But some morbid fascination, some hunger, had kept her here. The ballroom floor shifted beneath her feet. What had been polished oak was now soft, spongy. She looked down and nearly fainted. It was flesh. A carpet of pale, veined skin stretched taut over something pulsing beneath. With every beat, she felt it vibrate up her legs. The scraping above grew louder. One of the upside-down figures dropped to the floor, landing on all fours like a predator. Its faceless head tilted toward her, nostrils flaring. From the far end of the ballroom, a grand banquet table appeared where there had been only empty air seconds before. Candles lit themselves, dripping black wax. Platters materialized, some holding cooked meat, others holding raw, twitching cuts that still bled. But it wasn't the food that made Eleanor's stomach twist. It was the fact that every dish looked familiar. A roast that resembled a man's torso. A soup with floating eyeballs she could have sworn belonged to the gardener she'd met at the gate. A pie that leaked blood instead of fruit. The faceless guests began filing in again, moving silently to take their seats at the table. The upside-down crawlers dropped one by one, joining them, folding their spindly limbs into chairs. A chair scraped beside her, empty, waiting. The voice returned. "Sit and eat. The house keeps what it is given." Eleanor's legs trembled as she stepped toward the chair, unable to stop herself. The smell from the table was intoxicating now, rich, savory, and laced with something she couldn't name. She reached for the silver lid covering the nearest platter. Her hands shook. She lifted the lid. It was her own face. Perfectly still, eyes open, lips curled in the faintest smirk. The room erupted in a soundless cheer. The guests leaned forward, their featureless heads almost brushing the plates. The walls pulsed. The eyes shone brighter. Eleanor finally screamed. Her scream didn't echo. It was swallowed. The sound was pulled straight from her throat and devoured by the air itself, leaving nothing but the rhythmic thump-thump beneath the fleshy floor. Eleanor staggered backward from the table, knocking over the chair that had been waiting for her. The faceless guests didn't move to stop her. They just watched, heads tilting, fingers tapping, as though she were the entertainment they had been waiting centuries to see. The voice returned, thicker now, as if dripping from the walls. "You cannot run. The house keeps what it is given." She turned, desperate for any escape, and saw a hallway where none had been before, long, narrow, and dimly lit by flickering lanterns. The air here felt heavier, wet, almost breathing. She ran. The moment she stepped inside, the corridor sealed behind her, vanishing into solid wall. The fleshy floor gave way to something worse. The walls themselves were moving, slowly inhaling, exhaling. The lantern light pulsed in time with the breath. The corridor stretched longer with every step she took. No matter how far she ran, the end seemed no closer. Her panic rose until her chest ached. Then she heard it. Footsteps, but not hers. They were behind her, slow, deliberate, bare feet slapping the floor. She didn't want to look, but she did. At the far end of the hallway, emerging from the wall itself, was a figure that looked exactly like her. Same dress, same trembling hands. But its skin was pale as parchment, and its mouth stretched far wider than human. It was smiling. She spun and ran harder. Then, at last, she saw it, a door. old, warped wood, covered in iron bands. It pulsed like a living lung, each inhale drawing her closer, each exhale pushing her back. The sound of her double's footsteps was getting faster now. She reached the door and grabbed the handle. It was warm. It exhaled onto her palm. The voice came again, this time from both behind and inside the door. If you open it, you stay forever. If you close it, you never leave. Her hand trembled on the handle. The footsteps behind her stopped. She could feel the double's breath on the back of her neck. The door inhaled. So did she. Then she pulled. The hinges screamed, and a wind roared out, black and cold, filled with thousands of whispers. They weren't words. They were memories. Fragments of every soul the house had ever taken. The darkness spilled into her like water into a drowning lung. The last thing she felt was the door closing itself behind her. From the inside, when Eleanor opened her eyes, she was standing. The air was warm and thick, heavy with the scent of dust and something sweet, like rotting fruit. The room was small, maybe no bigger than a pantry, but its walls curved inward in a way that made her stomach knot. There were no corners, no edges, just smooth, endless surface, like she was inside a giant egg. And she was not alone. The other Eleanor, the pale one with the too wide smile, was here too. But now, it wasn't moving. Its eyes were shut. Its mouth was open, jaw unhinged, as if waiting for something to crawl inside. The walls began to ripple. She pressed her palm against them and felt a heartbeat. Not hers, not human. The pulse quickened, and the smooth walls started to split, thin. Black lines opening all around her like the skin of an overripe fruit. Through the cracks, she saw faces, not painted, not carved, alive. Mouths pressed against the seams, whispering in languages she couldn't understand. Eyes blinked slowly, fixated on her. The whispers grew louder until they merged into a single unified voice. You are part of the house now. The pale Eleanor's head tilted upward, eyes snapping open. They were pure black. It stepped forward, and as it did, Eleanor felt her own feet move without her willing them. Her hands rose. Her lips stretched into that same impossible smile. The house wasn't keeping her as a prisoner. It was wearing her. The walls split wider, revealing other rooms, each with a person inside, each wearing a different expression of silent horror. And as her body moved toward the doorway, she realized they weren't separate rooms at all. They were all inside one thing. The faceless guests, the endless corridors, the breathing door. They weren't parts of a building. They were organs. And she was about to become one too. The last thing she saw before stepping into darkness was her own reflection in a slick blood-black wall. It was smiling at her.